Hello, everyone, and welcome to my talk, Crafting Webcomics with Ember. In this talk, I want to show you some of the learnings that I had when I created my first webcomic, and I also want to show you which kind of tools and APIs I found really useful to do so. I also want to show you how I find Ember to be very helpful in creating online art experience as webcomics. And last but not least, I also want to highlight some of the advantages, but also challenges that come up when you try to bring your comic experiences online and share them on the web. What actually got me to this topic is something that maybe many of you in the audience also share, a big love for comics. I can remember when I was still younger, I would go regularly to my comic book store and get maybe the next edition of a comic book series that I was reading, and this was really exciting. And it was also really cool to share this experience with friends. And if you still remember your times when you were still reading comics, or maybe you still do, as I do currently, then this experience might have looked something like this, like different superhero kind of comics, Marvel and DC, different characters that try to save the world. In my case, for example, it looked a little bit more like this. I was a really big fan of Sailor Moon and the great artwork by Naoko Takeuchi. Yeah, there are also a couple of Sailor Moon fans here in the audience, I see. And it actually really inspired me back then as a child to become like an artist myself and actually do something really cool. And as you can see, we are not at Comic-Con right now, so it seems, at least for my day-to-day work, it worked out a bit differently than that. But still, I have this very big love for it, and I really liked to actually read comics and also wanted to try to a little bit out what I can do with comics in my free time. And in the context of preparing this talk, I actually was also wondering, where do comics actually come from? What is the origin of comics? And looking at the history of comics, it's actually quite striking how old it is. If you, for example, look at print comics, like actual printed paper comics, the story dates back almost 200 years ago in the Western world. For example, the Glasgow Looking Glass, one of the first mass-produced publications that resemble comics as they try to convey stories and also do political commentary, has already been first published in 1826. And this is only for the Western world. If we, for example, look over to Japan, we can find that the first origins of the so-called manga and the Japanese comic books actually date back to a much, much, much further time. In fact, already in the 12th and 13th century, there were scrolls and illustrations that tried to convey hero stories or of very famous soldiers that are known in Japanese history. And the term manga actually came up already at a very similar time as first comic books emerged in the Western world. So, for example, the quite notable kind of works, also known as hokusai sketches, date back, for example, to the year of 1814. And this is interesting to see. It kind of makes you think, wow, this story is quite long, and what actually happened in the last 200 years since then? In fact, if we look back maybe 30 years ago, we can find that some shift happened in there. It wasn't only about print comics, it started to be also about online comics. And in this regard, we can actually see this kind of progression that comics actually got to the web. And I want to show you some of the examples that I really enjoy, some of the comics that really, give me life as well. So, for example, I'm a very big fan of Needroid comics. This is an artist that uploads on his own website quite regularly, maybe every other week or so, a comic strip containing maybe 2 panels, maybe 4 panels of the adventures of different animal friends, for example, Reginald, he seems to be a bird, I guess, and also Bird-tato, which is a character that resembles both a bear but also a potato, right? And the humor is super absurd and really fun. You totally should check it out if you find this kind of stuff funny. And I'm also a really big fan, for example, of the work of Ruby etc, which is an artist who shares her work on Instagram, but also social media, like Twitter. And in this context, she kind of uses maybe 1 panel, maybe 2 or 3 panel sketches to convey a very fun and dry humor and just convey a simple joke in a very lighthearted manner. And I find in these 2 examples something very interesting already. Both artists use the web to actually share her comics experience or their comic experiences with the world. And this shows us how powerful the web actually already is compared to the print medium. In contrast to that, they actually don't have a middleman or any kind of publishing agency between them and the audience. They can actually just get started with maybe a website domain or like a Twitter account, and just like get started to share with their readers. And last but not least, what is also very important, for example, with Ruby2C, using social media accounts like Twitter or like Instagram, she also has a very direct access to her audience and actually can engage with them through the social media commentary. So I think this is really cool. And looking at that, like how easy it at least seems to do that, I was thinking, well, probably a lot of people can do this, and probably I can also do this. So I want to have a look if I can create like my own comic book experience. And I also thought about how is actually like a comic book composed? What do I actually have to create my first webcomic? And thinking about this, I figured I want to have like something rather traditional, something that actually reminds me of the time when I was still reading comic books like as a kid. So I want to think about like how a print comic is composed. And I think something that came to my mind is, of course, like a comic book consists of a lot of like different comic pages. This is like the basic structure that I also want to have in my webcomic book app. And so I started to actually think about how can I make this actually something that I can upload somewhere online. I'm an Ember developer, so what came to my mind is, yeah, maybe I should use Ember for that. And I started out, as probably a lot of like applications start out, by having a look about how my URL structure actually looks like and trying to build up my application from the bottom up using the routing system in Ember. And I was thinking it would be cool to an overview page and also like subsequent subpages that actually convey single chapters or pages in my comic book. And using Ember, it's actually quite fairly easy. Once I've set up my app, I can just configure my router with a few lines of code to actually give me back exactly these routes that I would like to see. And last but not least, I can also make sure that any kind of data that is relevant, like for this particular page, is only loaded on this specific route. And I think this simple thing already gives me a very great start off the bat to actually get started on the application and not have to worry about what I should do about like routing or different pages and the structure of my app further down the road when my application already has scaled. So this is really nice. Also thinking about the further composition of my application, I was thinking, well, it would actually be really cool to have like different comic panels, right? And in this regard, I was thinking, well, how does it actually work like in print media? What do you actually have to do to actually convey the story using your comic panels? In classic comic books, it's usually like there's text content, there's illustrative content in a comic panel to actually create something. And using different panels, we also can create the illusion of motion and that time passes and a story actually evolves over time. If you, for example, look at this example of like Calvin Hobbes, quite a popular comic that maybe many of you have already read, we can see here a very short 4-panel comic strip that tries to convey the story of Calvin trying to escape from his teacher in school, and for a short amount of time imagining that he's like in a spaceship and his teacher's actually like a monster and he has to flee of him. In the last panel, we can see that the scenery shifts back like into the real world, so to speak, and Calvin almost is hanging out of the window, just like hanging on the very neck of his t-shirt. Looking at each of these single pictures, we cannot really kind of convey a lot of story, but looking at after one after each other in sequence, something interesting happens that we actually do and is not directly conveyed by the comic itself. Instead, if we look at one image and then at the other image, we, in our imagination, actually fill in the gaps. And this gives us the ability to actually get this feeling of, oh, in these two pictures, actually, the sea seems to be moving. It seems to be there's someone on a boat, someone on the high sea, and there's movement in the water. Interestingly, like with print media, we cannot really do much more than that. Maybe you can add like speed lines into your illustrations to give like an extra sense of motion, but this is kind of like as interesting as it gets. But thinking about the webcomic that I wanted to create, I figured, well, there's actually so much more that I can do. And I can actually get a little bit like creative and actually try to use the APIs and like the tools that I'm already provided with to create something a little bit more immersive. And in this context, I actually want to show you a quick demo of a very great immersive art experience that I've seen that is actually not a web application, but a native application but I think something that is a great example of what we could also do on the web. For example, there is this very interesting graphic novel that has been created by an artist group around Marietta Wren that tries to create a comic book experience that is both interactive but also very immersive to the reader. And the application is to be meant to be installed on a tablet device, and as the reader tries to go through the story, they have to actually swipe through it. And they can see different layers of images shifting into each other, but also seeing the story evolve as they actually go through, through the application. So this is really interesting to see and also gives you a first taste about what is actually possible. And in the past, there have been a lot of people working to actually give us all these cool tools that allow us to create multimedia content and video content and animated content on the web. And I don't know, I just want to show a few maybe. Maybe you still remember Java applets. There was a very long time where we learned a lot also from another library that was actually kind of important for how we create in general animations on the web today. Because something that we might sometimes forget is that even if technologies like these, for example Flash, kind of appear and disappear again, many of the learnings that we actually have of this time and also awareness of the demand of these specific technologies still remains and actually can help us to create the new tools that we use in modern ages. And in this regard, I think one of these tools that is very interesting to mention is the Web Animations API. And this is also something that I quickly want to show you how it actually looks like. Just a quick show of hands, who has worked with the Web Animations API before? Who has tried out the Web Animations API, maybe fiddle a little bit with? OK, cool. So there are a few hands, but it's definitely not the majority yet. So let's have a quick look how it actually looks like. The Web Animations API is a rather recent API that is available in browsers or in evergreen browsers, and if you want to use it in other browsers, you have to use a polyfill. And it actually allows you to animate DOM elements and also make it rather easy using a very declarative API to synchronize animations of DOM elements. So this is really nice. And what it all boils down to is actually keyframe effect constructor that you can use to actually create keyframes, which is a definition of an animation on a specific DOM element using specific animation options. And then you can also pass in all of these definitions in your keyframe effect. OK, this was a little bit too much. Yeah, I have the feeling with this remote control, I really have to figure this out. Maybe it's a better model next time. But exactly, if you want to create your keyframe effect, you can actually pass in an array of different animation definition objects. You can pass in any kind of CSS property that you want to animate. And in this regard, you actually define different states that an animation should go through. And if you look at this definition, actually, you might feel a little bit familiar to something else. If any of you have ever kind of worked with CSS3 animations, this might actually seem very familiar, and you go OK, I kind of get where this is going. In a very similar way as CSS3 animations, you can also pass in animation options that define the duration or the iteration length of these animations. And once we actually have the definitions of the animation states and animation options, we can pass into our keyframe effect, and then we can actually get an object that we can use to actually create an animation and play an animation. We will see this an example just in a bit. So if I, for example, wanted to have something like this, an animated comic panel, I could kind of start out just animating maybe one single image. But I also think it would be really interesting if I could have a multi-layered experience, if I can actually have the feeling of there are different elements to the content in my comic panel that move independent from each other and actually create a more immersive experience, similar as we have seen in the Marietta Wren demo earlier. And in Ember, I can easily try to extract all this functionality in singular components, which make it really easy for me to also reuse all the functionality that I create with different configuration options, for example, different background images or different animation options. And using sprite sheets, images that contain different sub-images, it's also rather easy for me to create single animation states that I can go through using background position and trying to shift through the sprite sheet step by step. I can do so by the steps function that is provided by the CSS spec and passing this in as like an easing timing function for my animation options of the keyframe effect. Creating this keyframe effect can then be done in the setup function and also being returned from that. And using the didInsertElement hook, I can actually make sure that the element of my component, like the actual DOM node that should be animated, is already available and can actually be used to create this keyframe effect. Since several comic panels, or like since one comic panel has several comic panel layers, I also want to make sure that all the keyframe effects are first of all created of these layers, so they can be later on used in the comic panel itself to add playback controls. Passing down a setup function from my comic panel, here declared as like onSetup, I can later on in my actual comic panel component make sure that I take all of these keyframe effects that have been created by the comic panel layers and actually add them to my array. Using the group effect functionality of the Web Animations API, I can make sure that all these keyframe effects are bundled into one single object that can later on be synchronously played and paused. Using the timeline, which is also part of the Web Animations API, to make sure that time is actually equally tracked in all of these different animation objects, I can actually pass this into an animation constructor function and then later on actually create an animation object that can be set on the component, here called animation. And once I've done this, there are two methods I can use, play and pause, to actually make sure that this animation can now be kind of like navigated by the user, for example, or many other different means in my Ember application. At this point, I already found that two things were very, very cool about like using Ember. First of all, I have a very clear separation of concerns using components and also like routing. It makes it really easy for me to figure out where actually goes something, right? Like I can make sure that, for example, data is only loaded where it should be loaded, and it doesn't really interfere with the maybe a little bit more complex functionality of trying to set up the animations. I can also compose every kind of like piece of animation setup that is relevant to a certain unit of my application in a single component and make it highly reusable. So this is really cool. Convention over configuration actually makes it easy for me to make sure that if I start building my application, I get right from the right start and don't have to worry too much about trying to integrate other solutions, for example, routing solutions or a data layer later on into my application when maybe I have to do a lot of like refactoring. So this is really great. But I think probably the biggest benefit that I saw so far is that I also have like a great benefit from the community. There was this point where I, for example, was thinking, oh, it would be so cool if like people just like browse or kind of like scroll through the app. And as they do so, actually they will start to see that like different panels slowly start to move, right? So I didn't want like all animations to kind of like suddenly just like go up. I wanted to kind of have this experience of like, oh, right, if I actually interact with the app, like something happens. And thinking about this, first I was like, okay, this should be fairly easy, so I just have to add some event listeners for scroll events, and then I have to check at which position the current panel is, and then once I've done that, I just have to maybe remove event lists as well if I kind of like move to another page, and then I was already like, okay, I'm not gonna do it. People just like see the animations and whatever. But the good thing is obviously, if you're in Ember land, probably there's already an add-on for that. And in my case, I was lucky, and there actually was. So looking at Ember Observer, I quickly found an add-on called Ember Viewport, created by Sugar Pirate and still maintained by a group of different people that actually allows me to get a mixin out of this add-on that I can just like sprinkle into any kind of like component. And getting from that, I get like lifecycle hooks that will trigger every time a component enters and exits a viewport, for example. And this was really beneficial for me. And just like a few lines of code, I could already get the functionality that I was craving so much. And once I actually do this, I can now scroll through my application. And some of them are still images, but here you can already see, oh, wow, text bubbles and stuff like that. And also like animations. And this is actually really cool to have this feeling of, okay, like in maybe like 5 or 10 minutes of work, I already have this going. So this is really nice. And then I was like, OK, like I'm almost done. I just only have to draw the stuff, and then I just like push it out. That's all I have to do. And then I was thinking, OK, let's just like double check. I was just like wondering, OK, like who's actually going to read my comic, right? This was my question, like who's actually going to read it? And then I was like, yeah, I don't know, like probably my friends, like obviously, because like they want to show that they like me and the stuff that I do. And then I was thinking, yeah, OK, maybe like also people that don't know me yet, probably like people that are like me, you know, like people who are also just like me into comics, and people who are maybe like also into technology like me. And then I was thinking, yeah, probably it's like also people who have like the same capacity to move a mouse as I do. Or maybe it's also like people who have the same ability to see images or colors on a screen as I do. And then I was thinking, yeah, well, like I think I missed the point here, actually. I realized that actually not everyone browses the web as I do. And the audience, like the people who actually would like to read my comic, that might find the story actually interesting, could be anyone. And this also includes users of assistive technologies like screen readers. And then I was thinking, OK, like I know a little bit of accessibility, but I think I should really figure out how this could work in my webcomic experiences. Something that I found really striking about like creating this project was that I was thinking, wow, there's actually this very great benefit that I get out of the box just by using the web as a medium for creating my comic, in contrast to, for example, the print medium. Something I found really striking is that once I actually make sure that every kind of like text content that is integrated in my comic is not just like an image, but actual HTML, I can already out of the box make sure that someone who visits the page and actually uses the screen reader and navigates it can actually read what is happening in the panels. And I was like, wow, like I don't even need to kind of like learn Braille to actually like make this happen. And this is like amazing. I also figured that many of the images that I use that are currently not used as image tags that provide you with an alt attribute need also to be kind of like descriptive for screen readers. And I figured using role attributes, but also area labels, I can make sure that I indicate any kind of like background images and describe important context there is actually kind of like required to understand the story in it. And even if I have like groups of images, like different layers in one single panel, I can also make sure by using a separate element that is contained in the parent element, like the panel, that all of these together still have a descriptive text that can be read by screen readers. And actually using the new angle brackets component invocation syntax, it becomes even much more easier for me to do so. But just like passing in the attributes, I can directly bind the HTML attributes that I need for actually indicating the content for screen readers to the DOM element that is rendered as the comic panel. And something I also found interesting is thinking back to the 90s. I don't know, like who of you, maybe like a quick show of hands, has like watched Pokemon back then? Or maybe still does. I still do, actually. OK, great. It's quite a couple of people. I don't know if you still remember this, but I vaguely remembered and had to look it up again when I prepared this talk. It was like this incident that was somewhere in, I don't know, late 90s or so, maybe 1997, 1998, where there was this very big scandal in Japan when at one particular day, quite a large amount of kids were brought to the hospital. Maybe roughly 700 kids. And they all shared like a very common set of symptoms, like nausea, dizziness, loss of consciousness. And this seemed like a very abrupt kind of like incident. And people were wondering, OK, what actually happened there? And in a matter of hours, it became apparent that all of these 700 children actually had like one thing in common. They just watched the one particular episode of Pokemon on television that was aired for the very first time. And after a certain amount of this episode elapsing, the first emergency calls were made for the hospitals. The episode obviously got like taken down like from the TV and was not aired anymore, also not kind of like broadcast in any other country. So this was only an incident that happened in Japan. But the broadcasting agency and also like the television station, they actually had to figure out, OK, what was actually the problem? What could have been the reason that like these kids got sick by watching this episode? And in fact, there was this very particular scene that seems to have been the actual cause of the situations. And yeah, I won't show the scene, obviously, but there's, I can show you some of the images that were actually used there. So they showed like in very short frequency and kind of like very rapidly this one image, and next to it another image also with a very bright color looking like this. And what this actually creates is like a strobe light effect, something that is just like flashing intense light on a TV screen. And if you're photosensitive, you might react to it and very, very, yeah, kind of like negatively to it. And in fact, in this case, it showed that many of the children might have had like mild photosensitivity that hasn't been kind of like occurring before because they never watched like something like this, or it was not very kind of like so apparent. But in this situation, it actually, yeah, was like a cause for them to be very sick. And thinking about this, I was thinking, wow, like, you really need to pay attention what you put out there. And being aware that your users might actually have like a condition that might make it unsafe to use a webcomic is, yeah, crucial. So looking at all of these different parts, I figure that, first of all, the safety measures, but also keyboard accessibility are crucial for making my webcomic available for people. And also giving the user back control about like trying to view animations and opting in instead of just like opting out of it is also very important for those who have a hard time to actually follow animations. Performance-wise, I realize there's actually not so super much for me to do. Like, obviously, I shouldn't start optimizing something unless it's actually really slow. But still, I know there's some kind of like tricks that I can take to make sure that I already get right from a good start. Some of the CSS properties, for example, the animations with the Web Animations API are cheap to animate. So these are like all the transfers, for example, like also opacity, because they don't trigger so many of the different steps in the random pipeline that went through in the browser to actually render your page. And so if you animate these, you're actually kind of like good to go to actually make sure that the animations are as smooth as possible. But you can also just like have a look at different lists, like for example, CSS triggers is a website where you can check which kind of like steps in the rendering pipeline are actually triggered and how much impact it might have on your animation performance. And in regards to what could happen performance-wise also in the future, just I quickly want to mention this, is something that's interesting, which is called the Animation Worklet API, which allows you to actually create like a worker thread that is besides the main thread in the JavaScript in your browser, like while your web page is actually like running, to make sure that any kind of like heavy animation work that is executed does not interfere with any kind of like other process that you already have. And this is also really interesting to see, but still a little bit in the, I don't know if you can say it in English, children's shoes, I don't know, German style to say. So it's like still very early on. And last but not least, let's just have a quick look what we kind of like found so far. First of all, we saw that webcomics are actually going online and becoming like a real thing, that this new format actually gives us a completely new freedom to the form and layouts and presentation of our comics. And it also allows us to use all the cool APIs that are already available to create very immersive and very engaging art for our users that the traditional comic format could never happen to actually provide us with. And the powerful tools that we have on the web already allow us to, right from the start, create an experience that is inclusive and accessible for a large variety of people, and not only for the sighted and not only for the people who are very good with using a mouse. And last but not least, frameworks like Ember actually also help us to get the job done in a very kind of like convenient manner by benefiting from the community and also from the conventions that it provides us with. And last but not least, I hope what you take away from this talk is that it doesn't really so much matter what you're in the end using. There are many different tools that you can use nowadays for creating your webcomic experience, or if you want to become like a web artist yourself. In the end, it's really about your imagination. That is the actual limit to what you want to achieve. And with that, this is me. Feel free to talk to me later. I'm a software engineer working in Simplabs. We do consulting for Ember, but also Phoenix, Elixir, Rails. I'm also working at the Ember Times. I'm an editor. If you haven't subscribed yet, you should totally do that. And last but not least, I forgot the stickers that I have for my Ember Berlin meetup in the hotel. But if you see me tomorrow, I can also give you very cool hipster with Club Mate Berlin Tomsters. And with that said, thank you very much and have a great time at EmberConf.